This screencast will look at, I suppose, students that didn't respond to. I'm going to say you need to respond to the literature, you need to engage with the facts, or get your own words in. And I'm just showing where people haven't done that. So, for example, in this, there's lots of citations. They read well, but there's none of their own words, and they have 3 or 4 definitions of corporate governance. So there's probably half a page, and they listed them all in, and then went on to something else. So what I'm saying is, how they get their own words in is try to see what are the common themes. Are some of them looking at the financial side, or are looking towards an agency view of corporate governance and more a stakeholder view? Which one do you prefer? Which one do you think is the best? Just pick one of them and say, there's some different ones. This is the one that we think is the best. Just to get your own words in, some kind of response. For example, here's other things in corporate governance, and you could also comment on how corporate governance, is a more topical issue now than it wasn't before. And even most recently, the CRC, the Central Remedial Clinic scandal, and the top-up payments in the hospital have brought corporate governance back into the arena. And the PSC currently, interviewing, or CRC are hoping to bring them back in front of them. You can say some of that. It's relevant to it. Or as I said here, highlight aspects. That definition focuses on rules. This one goes broader, and then this one brings stakeholders. So you're just, commenting on them. This was just a line where they had the total misstatement, and left it didn't say whether it was material. So I'm talking about, is a material misstatement, so. And in the book it explains materiality. So in general, the percentage of turnover, percentage of the fixed assets or the non-current assets overall, would the misstatement turn a profit into a loss, or loss into a profit? Those kind of things would determine the materiality of an item. So you could talk about that there briefly. I think this looked at some of the problems that happened in the company, and they were basic enough problems, misstatements, and it would have, what people could have commented was something around here that maybe was surprising. Others didn't pick up on these, and these were to do with journals. So maybe there was no backup for the journals, or it was capital versus revenue, or there were booking revenue from the following year into the previous year, cut-off issues. So you could comment on lots of things there. One, I think maybe this might have been Enron. Some of the scandals, when they acquired companies, they didn't really account for them in the most correct manner. So we talked about one of the weaknesses of internal controls are that they find it difficult to deal with unusual transactions. So acquisitions and mergers are definitely fairly unusual transactions, and an area of significant risk. So you could even comment, you'd have expected auditors to have spent a lot of time checking to see that the acquisitions and mergers were accounted for properly. This is no supporting documentations on journals. So Bursford et al. Was the citation, and it was well cited, but the problem here was probably there was a page with lots of different citations and nothing from the students' words, when they could have talked about simple things about it being a major, or an internal control is to have supporting documentation for journals, and that if auditors would have been looking at a sample of journals to see were there supporting documentation, it's very strange that they wouldn't have uncovered this and highlighted it as an issue. This was taken from a source and cited, but it was saying how this person, this manager, told subordinates to do certain things, and all it needed was the students then to just talk about management override of controls. One of the limitations of internal controls is that if management are able to override the controls, well, then the internal controls are no good. in this project, I think they spent about a page and a half listing the various personnel and the sentences they received, but they didn't give any of their own sent words on it. And you might say it's difficult to do that, but all you need to do is say, do you think they were fair, proportionate? Did the person who was most responsible, did they suffer the most? Did they get the biggest sentence? Was it fair that someone who maybe was only an accounting manager that was doing what they were told got a, 3 years probation? That sounds probably that they did get a pretty light sentence. You could compare to other, maybe the other scandal at this, or you could look at other scandals. Like Madoff was a recent one in America. What kind of years did he get? Even if Madoff isn't one of your two scandals that you're talking about, you could still look at the sentence that's been given to him, because it's a comparator that you could talk about. This one here, as evidence suggests, more than one guilty party, and I think this was pretty light on audit committee, and there was no evidence given in the project, so that's what I said here, what evidence? And then what they should have done was talked about who was on the committee. So this, you see, they lacked an engagement and understanding the financial issues. Well, were they non-executive members? So in this, you'll already have mentioned what audit committees are and the function of them, so you don't need to go through all that again. But you might say here something like the members of the audit committee were 4 non-executives, or maybe they weren't, and it depends on the situation. And one of them, if it's recent times, one of them should have been a financial expert. So then that'll allow you to say whether the audit committee as control worked, or if it was before the time that the audit committee was meant to be non-execs and have one financial expert. Well, then you can say, subsequent to the scandal, it was recommended or prescribed, in the case of America, that one financial expert is on the audit committee. So here I think of some comments on auditors. A lot of the scandals are similar in that they were some of them were new companies, or companies that grew rapidly. They might have been in existence as family companies for a while and then grew very quickly. And growing companies like that has to affect the ability for internal controls to operate and as they should. So if you're talking about the company, you might be able to talk about that the speed of its growth may have contributed to its corporate governance issues, and I've listed some of them there in that. This must have been Parmalat talking about the fictitious bank account for amount, and once again something taken from a source, and students find it difficult to say how to say it in my own words. Well, you can always comment on it, around it. So existence and valuation of the bank account were two of the assertions. It didn't exist, or if it did exist, it was a lot less than what they said it was. So the valuation was wrong, but I think existence was wrong there as well. So you could bring that into it. Only former. So this looked at penalties again, and it looks like everyone was acquitted except for the former CEO. And do you think the auditors were culpable or should have been punished? Anyone else that should have been punished? Look at the situation in Ireland. We've had scandals in Anglo-Irish Bank and other banks with the banking collapse, and the auditors seem to have escaped any censure or any. So maybe that's something you could comment on. So even if your scandal isn't in Ireland, you can still bring the current situation in Ireland, because the corporate governance developments in Ireland at the moment are relevant to any scandal you talk about here. So same thing again. For a couple of them, these are two different projects, and they're talking here about separation, conflicts of interest between, alleviating the conflict of interest between small share owners and powerful and controlling managers, and so the agency problem. And then they compare this to Central Europe. If they had talked about insider versus outsider model and explained that previously, which you should have done, you'll be able to just talk about that here. You don't have to explain it again, but you'd say the United States is an example, or this is an example of the insider model bringing with it its problems of the major agency problem, whereas the European country, the corporate governance, there's a different type of corporate governance problem that arises in the insider systems, and it's to do with controlling family shareholders or small, powerful shareholders. When I say small numbers, like a family that still owns a public limited company and are able to, abuse their position and walk over, we'll say, minority shareholder rights. I think here I just had saying this wasn't great in that it's not great academic writing. In 96 we had Informex. We had, so you don't use we, it's a bit too lax or informal. So in 1996 the scandals included Informex. In 1997 scandals were, you can list them that way. And a lot of words here, but none of their own comments, and I've given an idea there for how they could have given their own comments. For example, a lot of weakness here, and they say Nortel's compensation was much higher than many firms, and they don't explain why compensation was a weakness, and then we have to assume that you knew what you're talking about. But if you've just taken that from a source, which happened here, there's no guarantee that you do know what's been talked about. So explain sort of, the key point here. So the key point here is about executive compensation, and you're talking about short-termism. For example, we looked at directors paying themselves too much, losing touch with reality, and also the main problem is the short-termism that Maureen talked about in class one of the days, where executives are focused on just getting the big salaries, getting the bonuses, and not concerned with the long-term growth or sustainability of the company. And thankfully that's at the end of them.